to remind you that this broadcasting is sponsored by the critical attributes of war. The first being a kind of armed conflict which was exemplified by the Battle of Tippecanoe. The second being between different nations, which was the British and the Native Americans against America. The third being political control of an area, which was exemplified by the Americans gaining their new land, well, new, I say, that they tried to move into when the Native Americans tried to stop them. But at the end of the War of 1812, once they signed the Treaty of Ghent, it was all fixed and they could move into their land, which was horrible because it made the Native Americans move on to reservations. But anyway, the fourth critical attribute of war was to change government policies. And this wasn't exactly exemplified in the War of 1812, but you could say it was similar to the British stopping impressment of U.S. sailors at the end of the War of 1812.
Hello there, I'm Jimmy Griffin.
And I'm Sally Johnson, and you're watching Hawk 18 on Channel 12.
Today we have breaking news.
In the late 1700s and early 1800s, the U.S. was a young and vulnerable country with economic problems due to the debts of the costly Revolutionary War. And on top of that, foreign trade became increasingly dangerous, requiring military protection. Meanwhile, Britain was busy fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, which, you guessed it, were against Napoleon, the dictator of France. Aren't people just so creative when it comes to naming wars?
That's exactly right, just like the very creative War of 1812, which was just named after the year it began.
Britain didn't want any mutual trade with France, so they wanted America for themselves. Britain and France both tried to stop trade with the other and America. The British laws that did this were called the Orders in Council. Looks like we have a little bit of technical difficulties. But France was an important trading partner, and America didn't want Britain to control them any longer. America was just like one of those rebellious teenagers. Ain't that right, Jimmy?
You betcha. I know how it is. I got one of those at home.
Oh, Jimmy. Ha 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 ha. But that wasn't the only reason America was annoyed by Britain. Although, Britain wasn't completely right when they thought America was anti-British and pro-French. America was mad at both countries, but mainly Britain.
Britain began searching for runaway soldiers from their navy on U.S. ships, because they needed all the sailors they could get to fight against France. Sometimes Britain mistook Americans for their members of their own navy. This was an impressment, or the act of forcing men into the military. They impressed 6,000 U.S. merchants, forcing them to join the service, although about half of the merchants impressed were in fact British. Many of them considered themselves American.
It was a pretty sweet deal, actually, to escape fighting Napoleon by running away from the British Navy and getting a job on a U.S. merchant ship. The U.S. referred to British-born sailors on these ships as Americans, but Britain, of course, still considered British-born U.S. citizens British, and therefore liable for impressment.
Then came the Embargo Act of 1807, which was pushed by Thomas Jefferson, the president at the time. The act stopped all trade with foreign countries. This greatly hurt the economy in America. It was extremely unpopular and was soon replaced by the Non-Intercourse Act in 1809, which stopped only trade with Britain and France. This act was also unsuccessful.
Well, ain't that the truth?
U.S. settlers started to move west into the land of the Native Americans, which they won in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The Native Americans did not appreciate this.
Tecumseh was an important Native American leader. He, along with his brother, who was called the Prophet, wanted to unite the Native Americans of the northwestern frontier, the South and the eastern Mississippi Valley. They founded Prophetstown as their home base near the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers.
Britain, still crossed with America, sent their agents from Canada to arm Tecumseh and his followers. American General Henry Harrison felt Tecumseh was a threat to the American power in the West. Harrison took the opportunity of Tecumseh traveling south to recruit the Creek Nation to march his army over to Prophetstown and attack.
The Prophet then ordered attack on Harrison's army on November 7, 1811. Harrison remained calm as his soldiers forced the Indians to retreat and then destroyed the village. This was the Battle of Tippecanoe.
Young members of Congress, who generally came from the South and West, called themselves war hawks and urged American people to submit their cause of war. The Federalists were those who opposed war because America had a small, poor military with little supplies. They wanted to keep friendly trade ties with Britain to save their economy.
James Madison became president in 1808. Congress declared war for the first time in American history in June of 1812. Madison was elected for his second term to serve as the commander for the War of 1812.
In August 1814, 4,000 British troops burnt and captured Washington, D.C. Many of the battles were fought at sea, with both Britain and America losing some. An important war hero for Britain was Captain Philip Brooke, captured the USS Chesapeake in only 11 minutes.
The Treaty of Ghent was signed in Belgium on December 24, 1814, and signaled the end of the war. However, since communications were slow at the time, neither side knew the war had ended. The British pressed onward to New Orleans, hoping to capture the city and take control of the Mississippi River. The Battle of New Orleans took place on the morning of January 8, 1815, with 5,300 British soldiers and 4,500 Americans. Only 70 American men were killed, while the British suffered over 2,000 casualties. This was the last major battle of the war.
The famous Star-Spangled Banner was written at the time of and inspired the later battles of the war. After Battle of New Orleans, Federalists gathered at Hartford Convention in Hartford, Connecticut, to send delegates to meet with Congress to stop the war. When it became common knowledge that the war had ended, the political party had lost its power.
There were really no tangible benefits of the War of 1812. The Americans, though, had a newfound confidence, now that they could show that they could stand up to the British.
Yep, we showed them. Now to you, Girther, for a report on the opposition.
Thanks, Jimmy. Girther here, to talk about the opposition. One important question about the War of 1812 is the following. What was the opposition's view on this war? Funny you ask, because I've got the answer you're looking for. Britain thought of this war as a slight conflict that could have been resolved without a war. In fact, when the War of 1812 started, Britain was already at war with France. They were more focused on defeating Napoleon than solving its inconvenience with the U.S. The other opposers of the War of 1812 were Federalists. They were an American political party who wished to stay at peace with Britain so they could continue trade. Also, they thought it was unwise to go to war with such a powerful military, when America had less than 20 ships in comparison to the hundreds of British ships at sea. Back to you, Sally.
Thank you, Girther. Now we'll go to Ivo with the U.S. perspective.
Thank you, Sally. As for the reasons the American Congress declared war, they were mainly caused by problems with France and Britain. Due to the Napoleonic Wars, there was tension between France, Britain, and their neutral trade partner, America. Britain and France were both guilty of trying to make laws to prevent America from trading with the other country. Also, various American ships were intercepted by the British, who were looking for their runaway sailors, sometimes mistaking a U.S. merchant or sailor for an escaped British sailor. When the colonists heard of these occurrences, they were outraged. The Americans would not stand for this treatment, but the only solution in sight was the Embargo Act, which prevented all foreign trade. However, all too soon, Americans realized that this act put a major stopper in trade and caused the economy to fall. Another instance of British-provoked American insanity was the arming by British of the Native Americans, whose land U.S. settlers had claimed for their own. The U.S. did not appreciate any of the mentioned events and were all ready to go to war. Although not all Americans wished for war against Britain, but generally speaking, the U.S. was done with being treated like a puppet by Britain. Back to you, Janet.
Who's Janet?
Cram it, Patricia!
Thank you, Ivo. On to Patricia with the outcome.
Thanks, Jimmy. The outcome was that nobody won the war, although the Native Americans definitely lost. After the war, all territories were returned, and the only new land gained was the land the Americans had already tried to settle in, but was blocked by the Native Americans. The British agreed to stop assisting the Native Americans and to be at peace with them. This, of course, meant that the Native Americans were forced into reservations outside of their homeland. These agreements were all written down and called the Treaty of Ghent, which was signed on December 24, 1814, officially ending the War of 1812. The Americans and the British didn't receive the news until after many men had died in the Battle of New Orleans. In this last major battle of the war, there were over 2,000 British soldiers killed, while there were just 70 American casualties. There were some issues resolved, such as the Americans getting the natives' land and the peace between Britain and America. Americans had also developed financial stability and a better economy. Even with these positives, it is clear that no one really won the War of 1812, although the Americans like to think they did. That's all for the outcome. Now back to you, Sally.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Now it's time to go to the justification report with Bill.
Thanks, Sally. The war was not justified. The reasons supporting the war would have been solved after the Napoleonic War had ended. The only reason the British were impressing American sailors is because they needed as many as possible to fight against France. In Europe, Britain was at major war with Napoleon and found the War of 1812 a slight conflict. Britain didn't want to go to war with America because it seemed pointless to them. America, on the other hand, was having her soldiers impressed into the British Royal Navy. What they failed to realize was that nearly one half of the sailors on American ships were British subjects trying to escape the Royal Navy, and the British Navy needed as many sailors as possible. It was a very foolish move on America's part to go to war with Britain, for they were having enough problems with just 7% of the whole army. If Britain went full strength against America, we would have been crushed. Moving on from the war itself, the risk was not worth the rewards. Once the Treaty of Ghent was signed, Americans were no longer being impressed, but that would have ended as soon as Britain won the war against Napoleon. Neither country gained or lost land from each other, although Britain allowed America to gain land west of the Appalachian Mountains, claiming a ton of Indian land. I'm going to hand it back to you, Sally, to wrap it up.
Thanks so much, Bill. And we would like to thank you for tuning in to Hawk 18 on Channel 12. And that's a wrap. And on top of that, Tecumseh was... What are you doing? Wait, are we starting?
Those of it.
Navy. Who wrote this? Do you have a pencil? I need to read. Major stopper in. What the? What's a stopper? Oh!
Max, you're fat.
In fact,
Dude, we're taking a video!
they're more focused on defeating the.
Is this a joke to you, Max?
12 is the phone. What was it?